I'll start the presentation, but if you want to maybe pin Kieran, he'll be doing the bulk of the slides. So
Okay. All right. Then I can. Do you know what I will do? Sorry, I'll just make Kieran. I'll make you co-host, and Remain. I'll also make you a co-host, so you can pin yourselves as you wish.
great. So
Uh, yeah.
can people see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon. My name is Lionel Eade, and I'm head of research at Allies and Morrison. We are a practice of architects and urbanists, and the paper that my colleagues Kieran Garrick and Roman Bigar will present focuses on how data can help to drive a more circular economy. Our presentation is structured into three parts, and I'll begin by setting out the context before handing over to Kieran and Roman. So circularity is a key area of research for us at Allies and Morrison. And while the work you'll hear about today focuses on building information modeling and management, it's nested in a much broader subject. So naturally, different teams in our practice have been approaching the subject, which is complex and systemic from various perspectives, whether that's via research in design technology, urban planning, or direct engagement with the housing and development industry. So where are we today? Well, we still live in a linear economy. And in this paradigm, resources are extracted, processed, and discarded, leading to waste and environmental degradation. It's unsustainable because materials aren't efficiently reused or recycled, and this creates enormous wastage. Around 95% of the value of construction materials is lost when housing decays into obsolescence and is then demolished. And there's also a loss of embodied energy. At the end of a building's life, materials are typically discarded, releasing their stored carbon back into the atmosphere, exacerbating climate change. For the construction industry to meet net zero carbon by 2050, both embodied and operational carbon must be reduced to zero. And for this to occur, it's critical that circular economy principles are considered at every stage of a project. So let's imagine that we live in that future, that circular economy. What would that mean for the industry, and what systems and tools would we need at our disposal? Conceptually, it would mean thinking of buildings as material banks rather than just homes or assets. It would mean a shift in design thinking towards planning for deconstruction and reuse rather than demolition. It would mean the proliferation of new facilities like material recycling labs, showrooms, and storage facilities. And crucially, it would require the adoption of material passports and new information protocols for which there's currently no industry-wide framework. And that would require new user-friendly interactive digital platforms to help a wider cross-section of stakeholders, so not just designers and contractors, but everyone who is involved in the life cycle of a building, from the supply chain to occupants, to enable better, more circular decision-making. It's uncharted territory, but it's also fertile territory. So I'll now hand over to Kieran, who's our head of design technology, to talk in a bit more detail about how a data-centric approach can guide us towards these possibilities and what the challenges are.
Thanks, Lionel. Next slide, please. So as Lionel has introduced, the challenge that we have is bridging the gap between the information generated from the extraction at raw material stage to the point where this set of components or systems makes its way to a building site, and our involvement in that as designers. And material passports was really the focus of the research that we carried out in the sense of an information management perspective. So it was quite a simple motivation, and that was how could we improve transparency across that linear process that has just been introduced, and really empower design teams, supply chains, contractors, and building end users to make better decisions on this, and better decisions in the sense of getting more life from existing components, but also the ability to recover and reuse those building components again and again. Next slide, please. And central to that was, from a technical perspective, was how could that really work in practice? We are all stakeholders in an industry that is extremely fragmented when it comes to information management and exchange, but engagement from all stakeholders in the project was critical to the success of this working, and that was really the premise of where we started our research. So just very briefly, the kind of 5 key criteria to this was building on existing industry standards and frameworks to ensure that we brought everybody along on the journey, and that was based around establishing a framework that allowed that information exchange from the outset. We wanted the technology integrations that we were using and experimenting with to be simple, engaging to client teams especially, but also focusing as well on the exchange formats of information between those platforms. The data, again, was critical to the structure of the research, and we realized from quite an early point that the sooner this information was extracted from a BIM environment and centralized externally to BIM, the better our chances really were of pulling in other important stakeholders along the project. And a really important part of the research, which Roman will discuss in more detail towards the end, was that interaction piece. How could we make that information, which is incredibly complex and not very interesting to 95% of people on stakeholders on these projects, how could we make it engaging and interesting, and the ability to do storytelling as we were going through the different stages of the project, and that, of course, encouraging a better culture around circularity. Next slide, please. And as any good research does, we lent heavily at the beginning on some of the fantastic research that's been produced before us, and mainly beginning with Orm's architecture. We've done quite a lot of work in this area around material passports, but also some of the more recent publications from UK GPC and the LETI initiative, which is really starting to ask fascinating questions around the economic models that would support a circular economy, and where material passports has a role to play in that. Next slide, please. So this again is just coming along from what Lionel introduced in the first slides, and how could we use this data to break that linear mentality that exists in projects at the moment. So the cradle to gate phase was just where we're extracting information and then processing and bringing to site, is really the blind spot of the industry, and particularly from design disciplines. It's not an area that is really at the forefront of your mind when doing concept design. And that feeds into that linear process of extracting the material to discarding the waste of a demolished building at the end of its life. And next slide, please, Lionel. And what we're really trying to do is connect that loop at the end. How can we develop a valuable database at the center of the process that can empower design teams to make design decisions as early as stage 1 and stage 2, with a series of assets or reuse assets in mind as part of that. And that's a really difficult connection to make, but the first step is getting the information right in the first place. Next slide, please. And to do that, you really have to understand how buildings are constructed and the different lifespans that exist across the buildings. Lionel, if you're okay, just clicking through this, I'll talk over. And this is really about how we can recognize some of the more permanent aspects of buildings, such as structures with a 30 to 300 lifespan, to some of the simpler parts around building services or the building fit out and FF&E. And we went through an extensive exercise of really trying to understand the low-hanging fruit and what we could focus on in terms of building components that had a viable reason to be reused past its life. Next slide, please. And this led us down the path to trying to think of buildings as material banks, but also, if you click online, please, how we could identify those assets in a way that had a link with the database, but also with potentially new facilities at a later date. And to do that, you really have to ask three main questions, which we have here. And that is the design process encouraging a building to be developed and delivered for longevity, so long-termness, which is often the case when we're talking about reducing embodied carbon on projects. Longevity is really your friend there, to have an asset that lives as long as possible. But the new train of thought in this area around adaptability within layers of the building, creating systems and components that are easily removed or disassembled to be replaced with newer assets, again, is quite an interesting concept when we talk about circularity and material passports. If you click on again, Lionel, please. And how that informs, again, the design process around standardization of components. Sometimes as design professionals, we're guilty of trying to create assets and buildings that are complex for the sake of aesthetics, but actually, as an industry, if we're honestly talking about circular economies and how we can achieve the quite stringent goals that we've set for ourselves by 2030 to 2050, standardization is critical for a circular economy. And how can we embed that within the design mentality? Next slide, please. And that filters into how we are creating buildings. So techniques around construction, whether it's mechanical fixings, such as a steel frame structure on a building versus a chemical bonding solution, which could be reinforced in situ concrete. It has a huge bearing on the ability to reuse and recycle buildings as assets. And I think that more and more that's going to be a fundamental question at the beginning of the design process, is in which of these categories are the systems sitting. And to be able to have those discussions, it's the availability of information. Without robust information around a specific asset, how it's disassembled, how it's transported from two different sites, and how it's reused, it's extremely unlikely that the confidence is going to be built around those building assets in a way that would encourage circularity. Next slide, please, Lionel. And this kind of filters down into the process of where we get information from on projects. So if we're working and beginning in a BIM environment, as we were in this use case, it's an extremely messy environment when it comes to data. And if you click on, please, Lionel, our first task was really to make that process as lean as possible. How are we going to reduce that enormous volume of information being generated on projects to a point where it's focused specifically on material passports and circularity? How do we arrange that information in a way that allows us to make credible insights into what's going on and organizing ways so that the visualization piece, which we were putting on top, was critically clear to the client team and other stakeholders in the project? That really was the priority on the project. And the guiding principles behind that were, we were leaning on industry standards as much as possible, because it's what the industry recognizes. We were trying very hard not to recreate standards around material passports. We want that information to be accessible, because we're recognizing there's a large volume of stakeholders across the life cycle of a component that need to be able to feed into that directly. Transparency of information was critical. Black box approaches were ruled out from the beginning, and that meant that we were going relatively low tech solutions to begin with, to make sure that those the volume of information was visible and could be interrogated, which Roman will speak about in a bit more detail. And then maintenance of the data was critical. How could we allow the client team to be able to supplement the enormous data sets that we were generating with relevant information through the operations of the building? And again, how do we scale that up? If you could click on line to the next slide. How do we scale that up in a way that's not just specific to one asset, but recognizes that some client teams with larger portfolios are highly motivated around the circular economy because of those assets. And how could we set up a structure and an information management framework that allowed that standardization of information extraction, storage, and interrogation across multiple assets. Next slide, please. And this is just a very kind of graphical way of explaining where that information was coming from through the design stages, construction stages, and operations. So quite a portion is still coming from the design stages because of the design performance of systems. Clearly, construction is where you're getting the bulk of that data because it's specific systems being specified through typical design and build contracts, and then recognizing that the client or the end user of the building has a role to play in inputting that information as well. And just to finish on the kind of guiding principles behind the data strategy, but also how we were going to visualize that, which Roman is going to talk about, was the ability to have high-level information in the first instance, so the layperson could engage, but of course allowing drill-down methods of getting right down to the data that's critical to allow that asset to be reused. And also, just on the last point, the low cost element of this. When we're talking about circularity and material passport, it's a long game, and we're talking about decades of a building, and we really wanted to avoid embedding kind of expensive platforms within the client team, and we developed a low cost solution to that, which Roman is going to talk through. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kieran. I mean, yeah, Kieran introduced it pretty well. I think the organization and hosting and the interaction with that data provided us with an interesting but very unusual challenge for many reasons. And if we'll look at the next slide, so, just first and foremost, because of the lifespan of the building, we're talking about decades of data, and that means a lot of stakeholders jump in and out of that data, changing it, across many years, and that also means a lot of different sources. You got the BIM model in design stages, you got the EPDs, the contractors, installation information, the maintenance information, and so on. So there's definitely a lot of work that needed to be done in terms of organizing or describing organization methods around that data. And then also just because of the various very wide range of skill sets of people that were going to input into that data. You have the designers in the BIM models who are quite good at inserting information left and right on their BIM objects, but maybe facility management and maintenance aren't necessarily versed in modifying BIM models or things like that. Can you jump to the next slide if you don't mind? Skip that one because this one pretty much said the same thing. So yeah, if we can cycle in there. So basically, this is a more detailed view on the workflow. If you don't mind cycling through just to the end. Thank you. So yeah, basically the variability and unpredictability of the input and output are one of the key challenges, and we wanted to remain nimble, agile in the way we address the challenges, and we have to adapt very easily to changes in market. Who's to say there isn't going to be a central marketplace for reusable assets in a few years where that data needs to be fed into, or changes in building ownership. Maybe people don't necessarily want to have to carry around heavy databases and a heavy user interface online, which requires teams of dedicated coders to maintain and input, or things like that. And we really didn't want this to be a drag on resources and have a lot of maintenance in terms of technology. So we focused on a descriptive approach and focused on establishing, different routes with a wide variety of platforms that can be used, as opposed to a prescriptive, very fixed term approach. And next slide will show that. We have then suggested to the client 3 simple routes, depending on the scale of the adoption that they wanted and the aspiration in there. We discussed this for quite a while, and these 3 routes were driven by the data hosting methodology, and the interaction platforms. They were heavily focused on also how do we integrate with other technology, right? So there was a very big need for being able to scan QR code on site, or in the building after while it's being used, scan QR code of assets and retrieve that asset on your platform. But there was also a necessity to be able to export import from the client's digital twin platform if needed, but also different future digital twin platforms if that was to be changed across this, the lifespan of the building. So scalability and future proofing were key. And also just, in case they wanted to adopt that to their entire portfolio or just one building for now while the industry picks up the pace. And this as all kind of combined into a very simple low-code platform that is based on an Excel database on the cloud that everyone can input, and that ease of input. You can jump in the Excel spreadsheet online on the cloud, or you can jump through the Access database that is linked to the Excel to modify it, but you can also access it via the app on iOS and Android devices or on the website. And everything is just completely low code, super easy to access. We can maybe do a quick overview of that demo here. So it's all based on Microsoft Power Apps, look extremely low code, and we can easily interrogate the data being present with very, very simple statistics, but we can interrogate also just in detail all the components in that database by length, by kind of materials, by level, by category, and things like that. So if we change category here and we click on an asset, we can then access a very, very easily access the material passport of that asset. So if you click on one of these, you'll be able to see and scan the QR code to locate the asset in the building. But yeah, once again, just all very much focused on agility and scalability for future proofing. Kieran, maybe I'll hand it over to you for conclusion.
Sure. I think important to highlight just a few of the conclusions that we had in our research. Lionel, if you, sorry. I mean, the first two I'll take together. It's important to say really that the uplift in data deliverables that we were generating from research like this compared to what the industry is used to delivering for COBE, for example, which is focused on maintenance of building assets, it was an enormous difference. So there is a challenge there, which is skills within the industry, particularly around RIBA stage 5 and supply chains, in how we can curate and organize this data in a sensible way, and also the maintenance of that data through the operational stages. That has been traditionally been a big problem within the industry is RIBA stage 6 and 7. And support is going to be needed there if we're looking to really build a set of material passports that are trustworthy. Next slide, please, Lyman. But the opportunities to kind of finish on a positive note is really to look at what's happening outside of our industry around the circular economy. and emerging markets. And when we first started this research, we were in the midst of quite a few projects going on hold, actually, due to the inflation of price of steel and steel framed components across the industry. And it's a fascinating insight into how the generation of material passport information and the tracking of a value of an asset through its life cycle connects you into a kind of an economic model that is really interesting to some of the clients that we're working with. So yes, the sustainability credentials of circular economy and reducing embodied carbon is critical and the priority here. But there's also changing culture now, or concept around actually buildings not just being assets that generate rental floor area in office spaces in central London, but are actually valuable commodities in their own right. And the last point I had here was on leisure technology, you know, again, to try and address some of the risks that we raised, which was data confidence and accessibility to information at various stages of the project. If you click to the next slide, Lionel. What we're looking at is trying to, in the next step of this research, is trying to rethink that central database idea and the limitations around that, and transitioning towards potentially a more ledger technology oriented review. So blockchain, how can we distribute the information in multiple sources, and then really raise up your opportunities to bring in the supply chain into that information exchange workflow, but potentially looking at a hybrid system where actually there's a small amount of key bits of data that are coming from the material passport, which Roman introduced, become part of that blockchain network. And then there are large amounts of data that sit on central databases within each of those organizations. So there's a lot of debate going on at the moment, how we might be able to get that up and running. And hopefully we can share some of that research with you all soon. I think that's the last slide. Thank you very much.